At some point, you've probably noticed it. You're not trying to think, but your mind keeps going anyway. One thought leads to another, then another, and before you realize it, you're deep inside a chain that you didn't choose to start. You might try to stop it. You tell yourself to focus, to relax, to let it go, but that doesn't work the way you expect. The more you try to stop thinking, the more aware you become of it. And that awareness doesn't slow it down. It seems to make it stronger. That's what makes this so frustrating. It doesn't feel like something you're doing. It feels like something that's happening to you, like your mind is running on its own, continuing whether you want it to or not. And the harder you try to control it, the more obvious it becomes that control isn't working the way it should. Because if you were fully in control, you would be able to stop. But you can't, and that raises a question that's difficult to ignore. If you can't stop your thoughts, what's actually keeping them going? Your brain is built to stay active. It doesn't wait for permission to generate thoughts. It is constantly processing information, making connections, predicting outcomes, and scanning for anything that might require attention. And all of that happens automatically. So even when you're not trying to think, your brain is still working. It's still producing activity in the background, and when that activity reaches a certain level, it becomes visible to you as a thought. That means thinking isn't something you turn on. It's something that is already happening, and you become aware of it. This is why it feels continuous. Because it is. Your brain doesn't stop between thoughts. It moves from one pattern to the next, one association to the next, creating a flow that feels unbroken. And because you experience that flow directly, it feels like your mind is always running. Not because something is wrong, but because the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem isn't that your brain is active. The problem is that it doesn't know when to stop. What keeps this process going is not just the generation of thoughts, but your interaction with them. Every time a thought appears and you engage with it, you extend the sequence. You give it more time, more detail, more presence. That engagement can be subtle. You don't have to fully analyze the thought for it to continue. Even a brief moment of attention is enough to keep it active. Your brain interprets that attention as a signal that the thought matters, so it responds by continuing the process. It adds more to the thought, connects it to something else, expands it into a sequence, and before you notice, you're no longer dealing with a single thought. You're inside a chain, and that chain feels like it's moving on its own. But it's being sustained by small moments of engagement that happen almost automatically. This is why it's so difficult to stop. Because the process isn't just happening in your brain, it's being reinforced by how you respond to it in real time. Another reason you can't stop thinking is because your brain treats thoughts as signals. It assumes that if something appears in your mind, it must be there for a reason. It must mean something. It must be worth paying attention to. So instead of ignoring the thought, your brain prioritizes it. It brings it into focus, keeps it active, makes it easier to follow, and that priority makes it feel important. Even if the thought itself is repetitive, unhelpful, or unnecessary, the fact that it has been noticed gives it weight, and that weight makes it harder to let go of. This creates a loop where the presence of a thought becomes the reason it continues. It exists, so it must matter, and because it matters, it continues. But that logic is automatic. It's not something you consciously decide. It's a built-in response that keeps your mind engaged, even when there is nothing that actually needs your attention. And that's what makes stopping feel so difficult. What makes this pattern so persistent is that your brain is not trying to stop thinking. From its perspective, constant activity is not a problem. It's the default. It's what allows it to predict, prepare, and respond to what might happen next. So when you try to stop thinking, you're working against a system that is designed to keep going. And that resistance doesn't shut the system down. It becomes part of the system itself. When you tell yourself to stop, that instruction becomes another thought. And your brain processes it the same way it processes everything else. It evaluates it, reacts to it, and often turns it into more thinking. So instead of stopping the process, you add to it. You create a new layer of activity, a new sequence that builds on the one you were trying to end. This is why trying to stop thinking often makes it feel worse, because the effort to stop becomes part of the cycle. It feeds into the same mechanism that keeps your mind active in the first place, and because of that, control feels like it's slipping further away the more you try to force it. There is also a strong link between thinking and the feeling of control. When your mind is active, it creates the impression that something is being managed, that something is being handled. Even if the thoughts themselves are not useful, they give your brain a sense of engagement, and that engagement feels safer than doing nothing. Because doing nothing can feel uncertain. It can feel like you're letting go of control, like you're not actively dealing with what might happen. So your brain fills that space with thought. It keeps the system running, not because it needs to solve something specific, but because activity itself feels like control. This is why silence can feel uncomfortable. Not because something is wrong, but because your brain is not used to that state. It's used to constant movement, constant processing, constant engagement. And when that engagement isn't there, your brain tries to restore it. It brings thoughts back in, not as a solution, but as a way to maintain the feeling that something is happening. Another factor is how quickly your brain fills empty space. The moment there is a gap, a pause, a break in external focus, your mind moves to fill it. It doesn't stay empty for long. It replaces that space with thought almost immediately. That happens because your brain is not comfortable with inactivity. It expects input, it expects engagement, it expects something to process. And when there is nothing coming from outside, it generates something internally. So the absence of activity becomes a trigger for more thinking. Not because there is something important to consider, but because your brain is maintaining its baseline level of activity. This is why it can feel like your mind is always on, because every moment of stillness is quickly replaced. The system doesn't pause, it continues. And the faster that replacement happens, the harder it becomes to even notice the gap between thoughts. It starts to feel like there was never a gap at all, just continuous thinking, without interruption. Over time, this continuous activity becomes self-sustaining. Thoughts lead to more thoughts, not because they need to, but because the system has learned to keep going. Each thought creates the conditions for the next one to appear. Associations form automatically. One idea connects to another, then another, building a chain that feels natural and unbroken. And because the connections make sense in the moment, the sequence feels intentional. But that sequence is being generated without your direct control. It follows patterns your brain has already established. It moves along pathways that have been reinforced through repetition, and because those pathways are familiar, they are easy to follow. Your mind doesn't have to work to continue the chain. It happens automatically. This is what creates the feeling that you can't stop. Not because something is forcing you, but because the system has learned how to continue without needing a reason to start or a signal to end. If you watch closely, you'll notice that thinking doesn't require a clear starting point. A thought can appear without any obvious cause, and once it does, your brain begins building from it immediately. It doesn't stop to question where it came from. It treats it as something that belongs in your awareness. That's what makes it so difficult to interrupt. Because by the time you notice the thought, it's already active. It has already started forming connections, already influencing your attention, already setting the direction for what comes next. And because you enter the process after it has begun, it feels like you're being pulled into something rather than creating it yourself. You're responding to something that is already in motion. This creates a sense of inevitability. Like once the thought appears, it has to continue. Like there's no clear point where it can be stopped. But that feeling comes from how quickly the process unfolds. The thought appears, and the system continues before you have time to step in. And that speed is what makes it feel uncontrollable. Your attention acts as a multiplier in this process. The more attention a thought receives, the more detailed and structured it becomes. And the more structured it becomes, the more real it feels. That sense of reality keeps your attention locked onto it, creating a cycle that reinforces itself. At the beginning, a thought might be brief and simple, but as soon as your attention stays with it, your brain starts expanding it. It adds context, fills in gaps, imagines outcomes, connects it to other ideas, and all of that creates depth. That depth is what makes the thought feel significant. It feels like something worth exploring, something that needs to be understood, and because it feels that way, your attention remains focused on it. So the thought grows and your attention stays, and the longer that continues, the harder it becomes to step away, not because the thought is inherently powerful, but because your attention has amplified it into something that feels impossible to ignore. There is also a subtle expectation in your mind that thinking should lead somewhere, that it should produce answers, clarity, or resolution. So when a thought appears, your brain treats it as the beginning of a process that needs to be completed. It starts moving toward a conclusion, trying to figure something out, trying to reach a point where the thought feels resolved. But many thoughts don't actually lead to resolution. They loop, they repeat, they circle back to the same ideas. And because they don't resolve, your brain keeps them active. It continues the process, trying to complete something that doesn't have a clear end point. This is what creates the feeling of being stuck. The thought doesn't finish, so your brain doesn't stop. It keeps returning to it, trying to find an answer that may not exist. And that ongoing effort keeps the cycle going, even when there is nothing new to discover. At this stage, thinking starts to feel automatic in a way that is hard to interrupt. It doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like a process that continues on its own, regardless of what you want. And when you try to stop it, the effort itself becomes another form of engagement. You focus on the fact that you're thinking, you try to push thoughts away, you attempt to replace them with something else. And all of that keeps your attention inside the same system. So instead of stepping out of the process, you remain inside it, interacting with it in a different way. But the underlying activity continues. This is why stopping feels so difficult, because the system is designed to continue, and your attempts to stop it often become part of the same pattern. And until that pattern is understood, it feels like there is no clear way out. One of the reasons this feels so difficult to break is because your brain doesn't recognize constant thinking as a problem. From its perspective, it is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. It is staying active, processing information, maintaining awareness, and preparing for what might happen next. So when you try to stop thinking, your brain doesn't interpret that as a useful instruction. It interprets it as something to process. It turns it into another thought, another layer of activity, another part of the sequence that keeps everything moving. This creates a conflict between what you want and what your brain is doing. You want stillness, but your brain is optimized for activity. And because activity is its default state, it continues even when there is no clear reason for it to do so. That's why it feels like your mind is working against you. Not because it is malfunctioning, but because it is following a pattern that doesn't include stopping as a priority. And until that pattern changes, the system continues in the same way. There is also a reinforcement loop that makes thinking easier the more it happens. Every time you follow a thought, your brain strengthens the pathways that led to it. It makes it easier for similar thoughts to appear again, and easier for your mind to continue the sequence. Over time, this creates a network of connections that your brain can move through quickly and effortlessly. It doesn't have to work to generate thoughts. The pathways are already there, ready to be used. This is why thinking can feel automatic, because it is. Your brain has learned how to produce and connect thoughts efficiently, and it continues to use that system whenever it can. And the more often it uses it, the stronger it becomes. The process becomes faster, smoother, more continuous. And because of that, it becomes harder to interrupt. Not because it is impossible to stop, but because it has been reinforced to continue. Another layer comes from how your brain interprets unfinished thoughts. When something feels incomplete, unresolved, or unclear, your mind treats it as something that needs attention. It doesn't let it go easily. It keeps returning to it, trying to resolve it, trying to complete the process. But many thoughts don't have a clear resolution. They are based on possibilities, interpretations, or imagined scenarios that don't lead to a definite answer. and because of that, they remain open. That openness keeps them active. Your brain continues to revisit them, trying to find something that will close the loop, and each time it returns, it reinforces the idea that this thought is important. This is what creates the feeling of being stuck in a loop. The thought doesn't resolve, so your brain doesn't stop engaging with it. It keeps going not because it is making progress, but because it hasn't reached an endpoint. And without an endpoint, the system continues. What begins to shift this experience is recognizing that stopping thinking is not the same as stopping engagement. You may not be able to prevent thoughts from appearing, but you can influence whether they continue. When a thought appears and you don't immediately follow it, something different happens. The chain doesn't form as quickly. The thought doesn't expand in the same way. It remains at the level it first appeared. That shows something important. Their continuation is not automatic in the way it feels. It depends on interaction. It depends on attention. It depends on whether the thought is given more space to develop, and when that space is reduced, the process begins to slow down, not instantly but gradually. The system adjusts to the change in how it is being used, and that adjustment is what allows thinking to become less constant over time. As this shift becomes more consistent, your experience of thinking starts to change. Thoughts still appear, but they don't immediately pull you into a sequence. They don't expand into chains as quickly. They remain more contained, more isolated, easier to step away from. This creates a different rhythm in your mind. Instead of continuous movement, there are small gaps, brief moments where a thought appears and then fades without being followed. Those gaps are important, because they show that the process can slow down, that thinking does not have to be constant, that the system can operate differently when it is not being reinforced in the same way. And as those gaps become more familiar, they begin to replace the constant flow that once felt unavoidable, not by stopping thoughts completely, but by changing how they are experienced. This doesn't mean your mind becomes completely quiet. Your brain continues to generate thoughts, just as it always has, but those thoughts begin to feel less dominant. They don't carry the same urgency, the same need to be followed, the same pressure to be resolved, because without continuous engagement, they don't build in the same way. They appear, but they don't expand. They exist, but they don't take over, and that changes the overall experience of your mind. It feels less crowded, less intense, less overwhelming. Not because there are no thoughts, but because they are no longer being amplified in the same way. That reduction in amplification is what creates the feeling of relief. Not the absence of thinking, but the absence of constant, uncontrolled continuation. What this ultimately reveals is that the inability to stop thinking is not caused by the presence of thoughts themselves. It is caused by the pattern of engagement that follows them. The way attention, reaction, and repetition keep the process going. When that pattern is active, thinking feels constant. It feels like something that cannot be interrupted. But when that pattern begins to change, even slightly, the experience changes with it. Thoughts lose some of their momentum. They don't carry forward as easily. They don't connect into long sequences in the same way. And that shows that the system is not fixed. It is responsive. It changes based on how it is used, how it is reinforced, how it is engaged with over time, and that responsiveness is what makes change possible. And once that becomes clear, the idea of stopping thinking begins to shift. It's no longer about trying to shut the system down or force your mind into silence. It's about understanding how the system works and how your interaction with it shapes the outcome. Thoughts will continue to appear. That part does not stop. But what happens after they appear is not fixed. It can change, it can slow down, it can become less automatic. And in that change, the experience of your mind becomes different, less reactive, less continuous, less overwhelming. Not because the system has been turned off, but because it is no longer being driven in the same way. And that is where the feeling of control begins to return. Not in stopping thoughts, but in changing what happens next.